What's up, guys? In today's Fan Friday, we're going to talk about what length of prep is the best for you. Now, this week's Fan Friday comes from Jared Feather, and I'm going to paraphrase his question because he didn't actually send it in the question leak. He had to send it to me via DMs just because it was so long. But what Jared was getting at was he says he's also playing devil's advocate here, which I can appreciate. And I know where he's coming from in this. He's essentially saying, what length of prep is better? A short, more aggressive prep or a longer, slower prep? And taking into consideration muscle loss, hormones, just getting it over with. And Jared made some very good points, and I wanted to get into some of those points into this video. This might be a little bit longer of a video because there's a lot of things to consider, but let's get into it. So before I even get started with this video, I wanted to talk about a couple of things, and I caught myself trying to find the answer to the question. And I was online and I was looking up some case studies on natural bodybuilders and their rate of contest preps and their rate of losses and the amount of lean tissue they lost, the amount of fat they lost. And obviously I'm finding different answers to the question because there is no one set answer to this question because there are many factors to consider. But I wanted to break it down a little bit simpler in its most simple way that I could as a rough guide. Now in this video, I wanted to cover a couple things. First, we're going to cover this rough guide, but then I'm going to get into some real life examples of people who do short aggressive preps or longer slower preps and prove that really it does come down to the individual. But stick around because I want to break down things a little bit more in simple terms to help people get a rough idea of where I'm coming from in this video. So if we look at this breakdown that I have, essentially determining the prep breakdown, it's going to be versus natural or enhanced. Obviously, if you're a natural athlete, we are more susceptible to losing muscle mass than someone who is enhanced. So let's get that right off the bat. I thought that was the biggest determining factor on how you approach your prep. So obviously, if you're enhanced or you're natural. If you're watching this video, self-evaluate there. So check off the box, natural or enhanced. Now, if your body fat, another big factor is your general body fat level. I felt like that was the second biggest factor that you should consider next. So, for example, okay, I am natural. All right, awesome, check that box. I started prep roughly at 15% body fat. So I would put myself somewhere right in the middle between that approach. So unfortunately, I'm kind of right in that middle approach. But if you're under 15% body fat, it means that you're pretty lean. And if you're a natural athlete, awesome. Okay, let's go to the next step. The next step down would be, do you have a good amount of muscle or do you have a low amount of muscle? So you have to, once again, self-evaluate. Where do I fit in that one? So for myself, if I had to choose on this graph, I would say natural. I would say I was probably maybe a shade over the 15% body fat, okay? And then I would say that I carry, once again, a decent amount of muscle. So if we go natural, greater than 15% body fat, decent amount of muscle mass, that goes to the moderate length approach, which is a 16 to 26 week approach. Now, for those of you who've been following me along with me, know that last year I was in a competition prep for about 50 weeks. So you're like, Brandon, what are you doing? You said 16 to 26 weeks. Well, yes, maybe I did not do the exact thing that I wanted to do last year in regards to my contest prep. You do have to take into consideration over those 50 weeks that I was in prep mode, all those weeks were not considered a deficit. So at the beginning, my prep started out with about an 8 to 10 week phase where actually my weight didn't move whatsoever. So I actually wasn't even in a deficit. So that's 40 weeks, let's say right off the bat, that I could have been in a deficit. Then there was 3 different phases where I took a diet break. So let's take that down to 37 weeks. And then there was about a 10-week phase towards the end that I was upping my food, reversing into my shows from September, mid-September through November. So let's call that another 10 weeks. That's about roughly a 26-week period, maybe just over 26 weeks. That was the more moderate approach. So my deficit was about 26 weeks, give or take a couple of weeks, 26 to 28 weeks. So that would be a moderate approach. Now, if you are someone, let's look back at this graph. If you are someone who, let's stick with the natural athletes because I feel like that's my audience once again. If you are someone who's natural, if you are someone whose body fat is under 15% body fat per week, and you carry a decent amount of muscle mass, you can do a short prep. You can prep under 16 weeks because you don't have the body fat stores that a lot of people do. You can lose, that weight, and especially if you have a lot of muscle mass, and this is what I failed to mention before, if you have a lot of muscle mass already, you can be a little bit more aggressive because even if you do lose some, you're still going to have a lot left over. If you don't have a lot of muscle mass and you diet quickly, you're more susceptible to lose that muscle mass, and then you're going to end up looking stringy. Now, let's look at the enhanced side briefly. Let's say someone, once again, if you're an enhanced athlete, if your body fat's under 15% body fat, you really could take a shorter approach just because, you're not going to lose muscle mass from dieting. You're probably going to gain muscle mass from the substances that you're using. The only time that I could see people dieting for, a longer than 16-week approach would be if you are enhanced and if your body fat is well over 15% body fat, and if you have a poor amount of muscle mass. But really, who is enhanced and has a poor amount of muscle mass, those two don't necessarily correlate. So I would feel like in general, enhanced athletes can diet quicker than natural athletes, just because you don't have to worry about the hormone side. Sure, it's going to suck to drop weight quickly, to drop fat quickly, because a deficit is a deficit. You're still going to feel it from eating food, low energy, stuff like that, but it's not going to hit your hormones as hard as it would someone that is natural. So this is a rough guide of things to consider. Are you natural? Are you enhanced? What's your body fat level at? How much muscle do you carry? Now, that doesn't take into consideration things like your food intake. So is your food intake good, when you go to start a prep, or is it poor? If it's really good and you're eating, 5,000 calories a day, you can probably be a little bit more aggressive with your contest prep because you have a lot more room to work. But if you're starting your contest prep at 2,500 calories a day, and that means you don't have a lot of room to work with comparatively. You're eating double the calories. Here, what can you be a little bit more aggressive with? You could make 500 calorie jumps on the 5,000 one, but if you start to make 500 calorie jumps on the 2,500 one, you're going to run out of room real quick. So energy, intake is going to be huge, and energy expenditure. How much cardio are you doing is another thing. Are you doing a lot of cardio in your off season? Are you not? Do you truly know where your maintenance calories are? Yes or no? These are all factors that jump into a prep that you don't necessarily. It's going to affect how you approach it. So for me, for example, when I was going into my prep, like I mentioned in this video already, I had about an 8 to 10 week period to start off my prep where my weight didn't budge. Maybe because I didn't know exactly where my true maintenance calories were. And I know I've made comments before in the past where I really don't like to use that term maintenance, but I'm just using it in general terms here. If you're at maintenance, your weight's going to hold. If you're under maintenance, you're going to be in a deficit. And I didn't start prep aggressively enough to get myself into the deficit phase, which was a mistake, which I won't do next time. I think if we really sharpen things up, this is me speaking personally, I could probably diet within about 24 to 28 weeks. That's the next approach I'm probably going to take. And what Jared was getting at, what we were talking back and forth, was that he said, and I agree, that if you spent more time potentially gaining muscle, in that surplus phase, you won't maybe lose as much on the back end. And I will say this, and obviously, it has a big difference between the natural and enhanced crew. Like an enhanced athlete, and everybody knows it, can gain muscle exponentially faster than a natural athlete. So yeah, if an enhanced athlete spends an additional 12 to 14 to 16 weeks in a surplus in a massing phase, they can potentially gain a ton of muscle. If I spend an extra 12 weeks, 16 weeks in a massing phase, I'm not going to gain all that much muscle. So there's a huge, huge difference, and that's why, once again, I can see why athletes that are enhanced would want to diet less and gain more, because they benefit from that. The natural athletes out there are going to benefit probably more from dieting than they would from trying to squeak out a little bit more growth, just because growth happens so slowly for the natural athletes. So I wanted to bring up a couple examples here of natural athletes who diet very fast and who diet very slow. So up first is my buddy Matt Bulgren. Matt is a natural pro bodybuilder, and he diets extremely, extremely quick. And Matt and I have been competing roughly for about the same time. Unfortunately, I've never been able to compete against Matt, but I've been following him, and I was always impressed by his rate of loss. Now, me, from a personal standpoint, if I was coaching Matt, I would not approve of this. Matt does his own diets, and by all means, it works for him, so that's great. And this is another thing that I wanted to bring up, is can you stick to a diet, and that's going to, dictate how long, you can diet for. Now, I'm not putting words in Matt's mouth, and I'm sure he could stick to a diet no matter how long he wanted to, but he just doesn't like to diet for extended periods of time. So he would rather stick to his diet, be on point for a shorter amount of time. He dieted for 18 weeks. Now, this is, yes, a little bit more in the moderate category, according to me, but he went from 210 pounds to 163 pounds, and I'll put the pictures here. So as you can see, Matt is, pretty beefy there, and he's about, I would say, like 5'7", and 210 pounds is stout. And he got down all the way, and here's his comparison picture, to 163, just absolutely peeled, insane. Now, Matt did say that his strength maintained pretty well. Matt's a strong guy in general, though, so his strength still maintained up, and I do remember following his prep, and he was still squatting, still bench pressing, still deadlifting, very, very heavy. I was very impressed with that. Now, Matt, I remember this, he did say it still was a big mental drain, and it still did affect his hormones, from a personal level. It's not like he had his blood test taken before and after. We don't have that information to see, but I remember Matt saying that it just hit him just as hard as any other prep would. It was just a shorter amount of time. Now, let's go back to somebody like Jeff Alberts, for example. And Jeff tends to diet very slowly. So Jeff doesn't necessarily get particularly over his stage weight in the off season. He gets probably roughly about 200 pounds. And Jeff has been competing for a long time. I believe Jeff's in his he's actually 48 years old now. He might be competing this year. You never know with him. He's always kind of in a constant state of will I, won't I. But Jeff is famous for losing about 0.5 pounds per week. Now, Jeff is a world-class bodybuilder, has done well. He's won the KC Pro International before, and, he's been doing it a long time, and he prefers the slower rate of loss. Now, Jeff, once again, being kind of an older guy, he can play that long game. He wants to preserve as much muscle as he can. Matt, on the other hand, I can see just from knowing Matt how, he likes to be like a bodybuilder. He likes to be big and strong, and he just likes to eat a lot, and he prefers the shorter prep. So take someone like Jeff, and take somebody like Matt, take somebody like myself, take somebody like Doug Miller or Brian Whitaker. So Doug and Brian, they both diet for roughly, that plus 24-week mark to 28-week mark. Historically, they've always done it like that. Diets for roughly about 6 months from stage to stage. You do have to keep into consideration with both Brian and Doug, they keep their body fat percentages in check all year round. Now, Matt obviously gets a little bit hefty. Brian and Doug keep it pretty trim. And I would say Jeff, he keeps it maybe a little bit heavier than your average person, but still very, very trim. Me, I would say I'm roughly we're along the same lines as Jeff, where I keep it pretty trim. But, I do try to gain a little bit. So, like, roughly right now, I'm at 190 pounds, and I compete at 170. So I'm 20 pounds up. Jeff probably competes. He probably stays around 25 pounds up. And Brian and Doug are pretty close to their stage weight at any given time. I mean, Doug's is about at, I think he competes at 190, and he's about at 210 to 205 at any given time. Brian is roughly the same, not the same weight, but a stage, pounds up above stage weight. So to wrap things up, there is no magical time that you have to diet for, because, what's going to happen when you go to diet quicker? Yeah, it's going to be tougher on you mentally and physically, potentially, because you have to be in a larger deficit. You have to lose more per weight, weight per week. You have to make sure that, there's no screw ups, right? You can't, one day you can't go off your plan and say, okay, well, I can make it up for the next week. If you're on that accelerated method, you have to make sure you're on your shit. You have to have your weeks where you're losing, your 2+ pounds every single week, if that's what it's going to take. Now, does that necessarily mean that prep's going to be easier? No. It might be actually harder depending on the person. Matt, like I said, can handle it. If I tried to diet for 18 or 16 weeks, I probably wouldn't be able to do that effectively because the deficit would be too large for me, and I think personally my strength would just plummet. I prefer a little bit more gradual method. Like I said, next time around I'm probably going to go about the 26 to 28 week deficit. Very similar to what I did, just be a little bit more aggressive out of the gate. Now, I'm not saying that obviously the 50+ week diet doesn't work, because it's, Jeff is out there saying that, it works for him and he prefers that method. It's very, very slow, very, very gradual. I wouldn't say that losing a half a pound a week, is optimal for most people. But once again, who am I to say that that's the wrong method? I do agree where Jared's coming from and saying that, look, if you spent more time massing, you could potentially gain more muscle mass, and then you wouldn't be able to lose as much potentially. But for somebody like Jeff, it just makes more sense. Jeff's at the end of his career. Not saying he's done, but he's 48 years old. He knows it. We all know it. He doesn't have a lot more muscle to gain, so he's trying to fight to hold on to as much as possible. Somebody like Matt, on the other hand, who is a little bit younger, maybe they want to get their prep over with so they could spend more time massing. With me, I only compete, every 3 or 4 years, so I take that more moderate approach where, yes, I want to try to, make as much room as I can with muscle growth, but I also want to give myself the appropriate time to make sure I get to the elite level of conditioning. So guys, there is no magical answer. Personally, if I had to recommend, I would say somewhere between that 16 and 20 week period. And I know that's almost double, but I think that's really kind of like the money zone when it comes to contest prep diets. And if you truly do get yourself into appropriate amount of a deficit, if you do keep your body composition where it should be, and if your intake is really where it should be before you start a contest prep, if everything lines up, if you do your homework before you go into a prep, then I don't see why not that you couldn't diet for 16 to 26 weeks and complete a contest prep. If you blow yourself up in the off season and you carry a ton of weight and you don't bother tracking your intake and it's all over the place, then it's going to just be a lot harder for you. But I feel like the more experienced person is going to know, hey, I really should keep my body weight in check. I really should track my intake. And yes, I should spend as much time as I possibly can within reason in a surplus, in a massing phase, to try to gain as much muscle as possible. So guys, what do you think? What do you personally think would be the best time range to diet for a contest prep? Do these categories that I made up make sense to you in regards to the natural enhanced, in regards to your body fat, and in regards to the amount of muscle mass that you carry? So Jared, thank you for your question. This was a great video. I hope you guys learned a lot. As always, keep dominating in every aspect. I'll see you soon.